Welcome to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project, where we share real conversations about risk, resilience, and the decisions shaping agriculture. In our last episode, we talked with Wesley Tucker, a farm and ranch transition specialist with the University of Missouri Extension, about the 5 phases of succession planning. He gave us a roadmap for transitioning the farm business. Today, we're talking about the harder part, the human side, because succession isn't just about assets and management. It's about identity, relationships, and learning how to let go while staying connected. So Wesley, welcome back.
Thanks for having me again.
We're going to get into the more touchy-feely side of succession planning now and talk about why succession is so emotional for families. And, can you give us some background on that? And we talked a little bit about this in our last relationship, but why is it so difficult?
Carisha, I'm afraid when you said the word touchy feely, all the men just signed off and canceled. So why is it so difficult? Being a farmer tends to be very difficult than most other jobs or careers. Um, let's face it, we don't do it to make a lot of money. We do it because it's a way of life, and it's often most people feel like it's almost a calling that we feed the world, right?
Hmm.
And so being a farmer is what we are tied to. And so part of this idea of letting go or transitioning to the other generation becomes, what am I if I'm not a farmer? And so one of the things I had to learn early on is this is really difficult from a person's personal identity. If I identify as a farmer, just think about how the average person who is a truck driver or a mechanic or a school teacher or a nurse, how do they view retirement? It's something that they look
Look
forward
forward
to,
to,
right?
right?
The day that they get to retire. It doesn't mean they don't enjoy their job, but they look forward to the day that they get to retire.
Hmm.
How does a farmer view retirement? Fear, right? It is something that scares them to death. What am I if I'm not a farmer? And so that is one of the reasons it is so emotionally charged and so difficult. That is also one reason that the senior generation holds on often with such an iron fist because they're afraid to let go. If they do, they are in some ways giving up their identity. Um, Symbolic capital is,
Hmm.
we talk about economic capital and political capital and all of that. Symbolic capital is my sense of identity and belonging in society. If I quit farming, can I go to the coffee shop and talk to the other farmers because I'm no longer one of the club, right?
Hmm.
And so it causes us to have an identity crisis if I even consider giving a chunk of the farm, a chunk of the management to my son or daughter. And so that fear causes a lot of issues for us.
Let's delve a little bit more into that. You've worked with countless farm families across the country, uh, getting through some of these succession issues. In your conversations with the senior generation, what are some of those common fears that you hear about?
Well, there's a lots of them. As we were just talking about the identity. What am I if I'm not a farmer? There's other fears such as, will my son or daughter mess this up? Will they
Hmm.
lose it? And especially for the older generations that lived through the 80s,
Right.
lived through the financial crisis and things like that. Uh, but again, that goes back to a little bit to the whole well, we were talking about it, the chores thing, right? Of what if they don't do it the way I would do it?
Hmm.
Well, there is that fear that they could completely lose it, but there's also just the fear that they would do something differently than I would. And that doesn't necessarily mean the way that they would do it is wrong. Often
Right.
the younger generation has different ideas and different goals and things that they want to try differently.
Hmm.
Maybe they don't want to do it the same way dad and grandpa has always done it, because let's face it, agriculture is changing all around us, but even those things, uh, sometimes can be a fear for the senior generation, the fear of the unknown, different technologies that are coming at us all the time. So all of that is a huge fear factor for the older generation, but most of it really centers around that idea of control. Just if I give up control, then I am losing that significant part of me. And that's one of the reasons why when we talked through those 5 phases earlier, that's where I feel like if I can really help them understand that your role is changing through those 5 phases, but your identity is not.
Mm-hmm.
So, as I talked earlier, the coach may be the most important role on the team, but often, so most people view if I'm giving up a little bit of control, I'm giving up my identity, but I'm like, no, you may be taking on the most important role in the farm family of being that coach or mentor
Mm-hmm.
to the next generation. Your identity is still preserved. That's why I say I never want to use the term withdrawal, because I don't want them to think that they are leaving and losing their identity. They are still just as important, assuming that role of a board chair or a board member in the operation, but I just want them to realize that their roles and responsibilities do change in that
Mm-hmm.
in that new place.
So, what about that next generation? What are they navigating?
Just like we've talked about the senior generation having fears and being under stress, the next generation has fears and stressors as
Mm-hmm.
well. So, they are facing a different set of circumstances than the senior generation did whenever they took over. And so just think about how many zeros you have to manage today, how many dollars of assets and the cost of things today compared to when the senior generation took over. Now that again, I don't want to take anything away from the senior generation. They lived through the farm crisis. They've
Mm-hmm.
had their challenges, but the next generation is facing different challenges that
Right.
maybe the senior generation did. Again, we just think about how much technology, think about buying a new planter today, how much education it takes to even be able to
Mm-hmm.
operate that planter, right? So they have
Exactly.
different stressors coming on, but I also think, and we have not so far in either one of these, we have not mentioned the dreaded word of in-laws,
Mm.
but you also have to realize that often I think the senior generation communicates with their son or daughter and they're putting expectations upon them. But you also have to realize that son or daughter has a spouse and they have a family and they're trying to manage those relationships as well. And whether we like it or not, there are generational differences in expectations. I like to use the example. My grandfather lived through World War II and Pearl Harbor, and so he was very much duty before pleasure. My
Mm-hmm.
father was a baby boomer. He went through a different set of life experiences, but for baby boomers, they really lived to work. Their work was everything to them. Every generation on down has desired a more family work life balance, right? And
Right.
that is not good or bad. It's just they want to spend more time with their family. And so I see the older generation saying, my kids aren't hungry enough. They're not willing to work as hard as I had to, while the younger generation is facing they have spouse or other people saying, why don't you ever come to my ball games, dad?
Mm-hmm.
And things like that. And so there's lots of different issues here that we have to manage.
And it really all boils down to communication. So, what does good communication actually look like?
Yeah, you're right. Just like the example that I said there earlier, does the combine ever shut off? Often for the senior generation, they would say once the combine starts, it doesn't stop. I don't care who's got a ball game or, a
Mm-hmm.
recital or what. We are not stopping the combine. Whereas the younger generation may say, "No, I'm sorry, Dad.
Yeah.
I want to go see my daughter sing in the school play."
Mm-hmm.
And again, that there is not a right or wrong answer to that. It is just something that we have to communicate and talk through. And so when we can have those conversations and deal with them in a civil matter, we can come with compromises, right? And we can create some boundaries for the operation. Good communication, you ask what it looks like. It is communicating early and often and all the time. And one of the things that we will get to later, I'm sure, is talk about family meetings,
Hmm.
part of communication is getting extremely intentional about it and saying we are going to make it a part of our life, even if we have to forego some other activities because of it. And I like to use the example of date night. I'll ask people in workshops, I'll say, how many of you, what is the key to a great marriage? And everyone will say communication, right? So then I will say, okay, how many of you have regular date night? Almost no hands in the room will go up. And I'm like, wait a minute, you just told me communication's key to a great marriage. So why aren't you stopping to have date night and spend time with your spouse? Well, the reality is, life gets in the way. The kids
Hmm.
have got to be fed and clothes got to be washed and house cleaned and, cattle got to be fed, fields got to be planted and sprayed. There's always something taking up our time. Family meetings and communication will not happen unless we get extremely intentional about it, just like date night, and say, we are going to put it on the calendar, and every so and so time, whatever that is, whether that's monthly, quarterly, whatever it is, we are going to stop and we are going to have family meetings and we're going to work through some of these issues and talk about some of these things. Again, date night doesn't happen unless you put it on the calendar and say nothing's allowed to bump it. Family meetings and communication will not happen unless you put it on the calendar and say nothing's allowed to bump it. Unless you make it a priority, it will not happen.
So, how can families separate those business conversations that they need to have from family conversations, those family relationships?
I think those family meetings are a huge step in that direction because it forces us to stop and say, okay, we're going to talk about business issues
Hmm.
now. We're going to treat each other like business partners. Now again, it's always difficult to separate the family side of that from that business. But when we can stop and get intentional and make us put on our business hat, you know, I joke and I stole this from Dick Whitman several years ago, but Dick Whitman with Whitman Consulting said, he said, I think I'm going to get hats for people. One hat that says dad, one hat that says, manager, one hat that says daughter, one hat that says employee. And so that whenever we're having conversations, we'll remember, hey, wait a minute, I got to take off my dad hat and put on my CEO hat right now so that we can have the accurate conversation. And I've actually made that suggestion for some families that it's worth taking a few of the farm supply dollars and go and buying these different hats and hanging them in the middle of the farm office. And so that when you have those conversations, it may sound corny to say, I'm going to put on this hat, but even that makes you stop and realize, okay, yeah, I'm going to talk to you right now, not as my father, but as the CEO of the
Hmm.
business. And I'm going to talk to you, son, not as my son, but as the manager of the livestock operation in our business. It just forces us to think about which hat am I wearing. May sound extremely corny, but it actually is a pretty neat little exercise.
Yeah, I don't think it sounds corny. I think that's really an ingenious idea because one of the things that I've always thought about, sometimes we are more polite when we're talking to our boss than we are maybe to our parent. There's something about that familiar relationship. Maybe it blurs that line and you're more honest or more snarky than you would be if you were actually speaking to your boss. And so I think just having something like that reminds you of who that person is. So if you're an employee and you're talking to your boss or talking to the CEO, that you're going to be professional in doing that. And also that maybe if there are family issues, that those are being left separate, that you're not bringing those into those business conversations. I
Yeah,
like that.
because it's really easy to let them bleed across, right? It's
Right.
really easy to let the family relationships, because I'm your son or because I'm your brother,
Mm-hmm.
overshadow the business relationships. Think about what happens when you do need to hold someone else accountable. When
Right.
someone's not doing their job as they should, right? How do I discipline my son-in-law or my daughter or
Mm-hmm.
someone who's not pulling their weight? Well, again, if I can make myself take off my dad hat and put on my CEO hat and have that difficult conversation, because we can't allow that to happen. Here's the deal. We talked about it in the earlier session. Separating family from business relationships, we think about it in the vein that, okay, that's what's necessary to have a good functioning business. but it also protects the family relationships.
Mm-hmm.
Because if I am letting family relationships overshadow my business relationships, it will eventually erode the business, but it will destroy the family then. Because just think about when I have two of my kids that are in the family operation, and one of them's working really hard and one of them's hardly working, right? If I continue to treat them like my kids and don't hold the one that's hardly working accountable, what's happening to the son or daughter that's working hard?
Mm-hmm.
Well, eventually it's going to destroy those family
Yeah.
relationships as well. And so separating those two, yes, it is what's necessary for the business, but it's also what's necessary to protect the family as well.
I like when you're describing these regular meetings how it helps you to have intentional conversations. How often should they have these meetings?
Well, I like to talk about three different types of family meetings. I talk about farm operating meetings, farm business meetings, and family council meetings. And so if I ask a family, do you have farm business meetings? They'd probably say, yeah, we sure do. We meet every Monday morning and we talk about what fields need to be sprayed this week, what cattle need to be
Mm,
worked, and I'm like, yeah, those are important meetings, but those are really what I would say operational type issues, right? You're
mm-hmm.
really not focusing on the broader managing the business. So
Right.
I call those farm operating meetings. And yeah, those happen on an ongoing basis all the time. Farm business meetings are where we actually back up and actually think about the business as a whole and think about strategy and think about long-term planning for the future. And we think about succession planning and we think about diversification and trying to do different things, right? The problem is those meetings tend to not happen because we're so busy farming, right? And we haven't even talked about the whole idea of what's the difference between farming and business, right? Most people
Mm,
say, well, this isn't business, this is farming. No, farming is a business, right? It's farming business. And
mm-hmm.
so that farm business meeting is where we back up and actually have some of those important business discussions. The more often we can do those, the better. At least quarterly. I would love to see families take time to meet once a month, but if I can at least get families having regular business meetings quarterly, it's a good step in the right direction. Then the third type of family meeting that we talk about is family council meetings. And this is where we, at least once a year, preferably, we bring all family members together and let everyone in the family know what's going on in the family business. See, farm business meetings were for only those that were involved in the farming operation. Family council meetings now include everyone, all
Okay.
my siblings, right? All the in-laws, all of that type stuff. And those are the meetings that scare everybody to death,
Mm,
right? No one wants to have those because they know there's different expectations. They know
right.
there's conflict between the on farm and the off farm kids and all of this stuff. But again, as I said earlier, if we know there's conflict and we stick our head in the sand and do nothing about it, it obviously is going to go away, right? No, it's going to get worse, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so if you want your son or daughter to have a chance to hold the farm together and continue your legacy after you're gone, if you want your kids to be an actual family after you're gone, then these meetings become vitally important for you to set the stage and to start those relationships working well together while you are still here to help guide the process.
So, what does it look like for that senior generation to move from operator to mentor as someone that's guiding that process?
I think it looks different in different operations depending on what role that person wants to play. Again, as I said earlier, most people view uh, me stepping back and letting them take over as okay, I hand the whole set of keys to you now and it's all at once. But I like to think of it as a gradual, slow process. I do think you have to worry about how we set the image. And as I mentioned that earlier of saying, try to think of yourself as moving from the CEO to the board chair.
Mm-hmm.
You know, how do we create that structure where I can still be involved and I can still help mentor you along the way, but that I don't overshadow you by me being the dictator.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things in that is to me is the role of those family meetings, right? If we can say, okay, we're going to meet once a month and we're going to have some of these discussions, Dad, and at those in those meetings I'm going to ask you for some guidance as the chairman of the board. But in between those meetings, right, on the day-to-day part of the operation, I'm the CEO and I'm going to run things. And
Mm-hmm.
I think that helps create some of those boundaries where we see where our role is. Okay, in between those meetings, yeah, I may be the one driving the tractor because as a senior generation, I may still be out there driving the tractor, kind of like any other employee, but I'm not the one in charge today, right? My
Mm-hmm.
son is.
Right.
He's taken the lead and he's the CEO of the operation. But then when we come together for our family business meeting, that's my opportunity to help provide guidance and help lead in the operation as well. And so again, I think just separating those roles and creating those boundaries,
Mm-hmm.
again, that's one of the reasons why I feel like family meetings really help in this because they help add that structure to it. And I would actually encourage everyone, oh, this is going to blow everyone's mind. I've always said everyone should have a job description on the farm, right? What is my job? What is my job? What is my responsibility? What role do I fill? I think the senior generation should have a job description that we all agree to. I think the younger generation should have a job description. And so within that job description, what is my role? My role is as a senior generation is not the day-to-day running of the operation, is not to make those ongoing decisions, but is to be in the background and provide mentorship and guidance when asked for.
What do successful transitions have in common? And you spoke a little bit to this. You gave us, a lot of different examples, and I think everyone has gleaned a lot from our conversation. But if you could narrow it down to just a few things, what would you leave us with?
I think the most successful families doing this that I've seen are the ones that start early and just make it an integral part of their family business
Mm-hmm.
structure, right? Just like we talked about chores. I mean, if you start with the younger generation when they're in their 20s and 30s and you start them in phase 3 and you start working it up through the line, it just becomes part of our culture in our family business. But what happens is, again, often the senior generation holds on to the reins way too tight, too long. And so this becomes very clunky when we have to do it in a short
Mm-hmm.
amount of time. Uh, you hear that I love using examples I've heard other educators use. I heard Rena Striegel one time describe it as like a plane landing on a runway. If any of you have ever been on a large plane that had to land on a short runway, that's a scary experience because the
Yeah.
pilot's got to really get that plane stopped. You know, Passengers can get injured in the
Mm-hmm.
process because you're slammed against your seatbelt or the side of the plane or the person next to you. And if that pilot's not really, really good, that plane might go off the end of the runway and
Mm.
crash and burn. You know, that's what happens when we wait to start this process late in life. If we wait until dad's just been diagnosed with cancer and we got 6 months to get all of this worked through, or heaven forbid, the funeral was yesterday, I promise you that's going to be a violent landing. And if
Mm.
we are not extremely lucky, uh, we could end up with a for sale sign on our farm and a destroyed family.
Yeah.
Now, if we start early in life, we've got an extremely long runway and we have the time to work through this and build that culture. And again, one of the things that we didn't mention earlier is if we do this right, hopefully when we are in phase 5 where the senior generation is transitioning and letting the younger generation take the lead. Hopefully, there is a third generation starting back in phase 1 at this point,
Mm-hmm.
and it can just become a culture of where we are making those transitions slowly over time. But that's an extremely long runway. That landing can be really smooth. So I think if you had to ask me what I see in common of the families that do this well is that it's where they start very, very early in life, uh, preparing that next generation to be
Hmm.
the successor many years before they're actually going to take over, but where they start preparing them and developing this, just like you said, you're trying to prepare your kids as they do their chores.
Well, last question. If there is a family that's listening that's still avoiding this conversation, what would you say to them?
Yeah. Again, I'll steal something from one of my mentors. Dr. John Baker used to say he would ask families, how important is it to you that a Smith is going to be farming Smith
Mm,
land 5 years or 10 years after you're gone? And
hmm.
if you tell me that's extremely important to you, do you really want to continue to put your legacy at risk by not dealing with this?
Right.
And I flat out tell people, if you are going to be someone that tells me my kids get along pretty good, I think they'll work this out after I'm gone, because we haven't even talked today about the fair versus equal.
Hmm.
What do I do when I have four kids and one wants to take over the farm? But if you're someone that's going to tell me that I think my kids will work it out, my advice to you right now is just go get the for sale sign now, because that's what's going to happen after you're gone. So if you want your family legacy to continue, if you want your family to be a family, you got to do the hard work now. Take the responsibility and start the conversations.
Wesley, thank you so much for your time, for being with us for this two-part episode. You've left us so many nuggets, so many things to contemplate and to ponder. And I know all of our listeners, they'll be sharing this episode out with others and their families, friends, so everyone can benefit from, again, your insights and your wisdom. Succession planning isn't just about passing down a farm or ranch. It's about passing down opportunity, responsibility, and legacy. These conversations aren't easy, but they matter. Thanks for listening to Rooted and Ready from Annie's Project, where we learn, share, and grow together. Until next time, stay rooted and ready.